Hello, everyone. My name is Travis Wagner. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of South Carolina's School of Library and Information Science, as well as an adjunct instructor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies here at USC. So, I'm going to talk to you a bit about neutrality, advocacy, and librarianship today, and sort of your role as a practitioner in all of this. So, the first thing I want to do is talk through this ethics of doing advocacy and what it means for you as a practitioner to do advocacy. So, the first thing I want you to understand and sort of work towards is the danger of assuming community buy in as your work involves outreach and advocacy or work with historically marginalized populations. And I say this because there's a sort of notion that libraries are inherently a space that people want to come to. And for some people, that's true. However, it's a space that's also historically complex for its relationships to diverse communities, right? Not everyone has historically had a positive experience with libraries. And I think what is unfortunately true still today is that there are many people in many communities who still have negative relationships that need to be overcome. And this is sort of the work of librarianships to do and not necessarily something we can expect the communities to do themselves. Because again, we are the ones that practice librarianship in a problematic way, not the communities who did something as a problem. And this can build into what we see as wanting to avoid deficit models when we work as librarians, because again, if we see something like a community needing literacy aid from us, it's not the fault of the community that they don't have this thing. They may have alternative ways of doing literacy, and it's our jobs to help build that literacy, not to sort of implant onto them a notion of what literacy or aid or any of these things look like. And importantly, what I want us to think about is that sometimes what we think of as visible and positive advocacy work may not be the best advocacy work. I'm a huge fan of both drag queen story times and diverse book displays, but sometimes there's more tangible on the ground things you can be doing as advocacy for communities like folks of color or communities like the LGBTQ community that may not be what happens at the library and happens visibly in the library. And I'm going to provide my contact information at the end, and if you have further questions on what I mean by that, I'm happy to talk to you about that. And then finally, what I want you to think about is that advocacy asks you for you to sort of go to communities and work with the communities as opposed to sort of expecting communities to sort of ask you for help or wait for the communities to come to you, right? This is a thing that outreach often overlooks, is that it's the sort of notion that if you build something, communities will just show up. And that's unfortunately not true, and something that needs to be made clear when you're thinking about this work. So, some books that influence the way I think about this, and I would strongly encourage you to check out if you're going to continue to do work in diversity or sort of attend a librarianship as an institution, are Sarah Ahmed's On Being Included. So she looks at racism and diversity within institutional life. She's particularly looking at academic libraries, but I think a lot of what she says holds true for librarianship as well, particularly her explorations and understanding of the way that like diversity is used as a thing that's valuable, but doesn't attend to the way in which representation and access are still very, very difficult for historically marginalized people. The second book I would ask you to check out would be Wagner and Weigand's The Desegregation of Public Libraries in the Jim Crow South. These authors do a really great job of sort of showing that even though we think of public libraries as always being inclusive, open, and accessible to all people, there were also sites that were contested during the civil rights era, and desegregation was something that also had to happen there as well. And while I think it's important that this piece is about the Jim Crow South specifically, I do want to note that desegregation was a thing that happened across the United States and was not a unique thing to libraries in the South, right? And then finally, I would encourage you to check out Shannon Sullivan's Good White People, The Problem of Middle Class White Anti-Racism. In this book, she shows how much of our rhetoric around doing anti-racist work or calling things racist gets located on a problem that only happens in rural, lower class populations, i.e., these are the types of people that are racist. I'm not racist. And what she says is there's a problem because what's not happening is a discussion of how racism just exists across institutions and exists in even these spaces that are progressive, right? So it's really unpacking one's proximity to something like systemic racism, but it also holds true for other marginalized identities and points of privilege as well. But I think, again, a really good book that unpacks the way in which a lot of these discussions are avoided by saying it's a problem that somebody else has and it's not me doing it. But again, libraries themselves are not historically spaces that have assumed diversity, right? So Stauffer has this really great piece about school libraries or sort of youth in libraries called Libraries of the Home of Books. And they do a content analysis of all of these advertisements and all of these books about kids going to libraries, and not a single one of them represented a child of color in any positive light. So it was again assumed a space that only young white kids would use. And if that's a narrative that's not even 50 years old, right, you can understand how institutionally certain communities might not see a library as a space for them. So I also encourage you to check out that book, if or sorry, that's a journal article, to read that to get a bit more context as well. So the question then becomes, what does good advocacy look like if we know all of these things to be true about librarianship? Well, I think the first thing you need to understand is that this always has to be an iterative practice, right? You always have to change and alter your practice of advocacy to deal with the unique needs of your communities. There's not one fixed way of doing it. And even when you find something that works, that does not mean it's going to work into perpetuity. Practitioners like yourself also need to think about practicing your own positionality in your work. So positionality comes from qualitative research. It's this practice of naming your identities and understanding what those identities give you as points of privilege and relational and oppression to the people you're working with, right? So how might your gender identity, your race, your class, your religion, your sexual orientation, how might all of these play into your work with communities who possess similar or different identities, right? So it's a really good practice to think about, what does it mean for me with the identities I have to go do work with people who have maybe different identities than me. And if you haven't practiced this before, I think it's a really, really good exercise. And again, if it's something you want to talk about, I'm happy to talk to you about it via email and other discussions. It's also important to note that communities don't possess universal identities, but intersectional identities within communities. So what I mean by this is that even if you're going to go work with a community that's a bunch of folks of color, that's not a experience that cuts across universally, right? So what it means to be a woman of color is a very different experience from what it means to be a man of color, just as it's, different within LGBTQ identities if you're a gay person versus if you identify as transgender, right? So understanding even that work has a lot of individual context inside of it that can't be attended to just by saying you're working through this particular identity or with this particular population. What is also really important to understand is that as you're doing this work, you're not going to immediately or arguably ever move from being an outsider to an insider, right? So you have to understand that even if you build trust with the communities you're working with, that's not a guarantee that it will last forever, nor that they will actually long-term trust you or do trust you. This might be temporary, and it doesn't mean that you have gained all of the sort of positive identities within their eyes. And again, advocacy is not about removing or undoing differences. This is something that's really important to think about, right? Because it's easy to say, well, if we just got rid of difference, everyone would get along. That's not the point here. What we want to think about is how we can engage and leverage difference as a positive social practice to sort of celebrate and use in a positive way. And for this, I really like to borrow from what I find to be my favorite librarian in all of the history of librarianship, and that would be Audre Lorde. She only briefly spent time as a librarian, but she ended up becoming a really prominent Black feminist thinker. And this is a sort of paraphrasing of one of her popular statements. And she says, quote, "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." So advocacy should be a process of celebrating difference and not a process of undoing difference. And these are very, very seemingly subtle differences, but I think important to the type of work we should be doing in librarianship. And also understand that this is a practice that has very different local and global context, right? So what you're learning to do within your cohort will be very different than what you might do as you expand outward and think about it in global context. So just think about the way libraries provide spaces for innovation, right? So Laura's talking about how we might push these things into different discussions if we were doing this type of work in, say, Africa. So he says, quote, "A problem that tends to be ignored in innovation studies is that of inequality, where the benefits following from adaptation are not equally distributed among a population in which diffusion has taken place." For example, small peasant farmers who are not eligible for bank loans may be unable to adopt an innovation that enables farmers with larger holdings and access to credit to outcompete and ultimately displace them. So, again, thinking about access points, what literacy looks like for individual communities is not a universal thing. It goes back to that point of it being iterative and context specific for your communities. So, again, it's going to be challenging and potentially stressful, but each attempt at advocacy has to be tailored to the groups that you're working with. And in terms of this question of neutrality, I fall hard on the side that libraries are not neutral spaces, nor should we think that they're neutral spaces. You as a practitioner should do your best to provide for your patrons, but you have to understand your own, again, positionality in all of this. So Emily Drabinsky has this really, really great piece on her blog, something that she read at ALA a couple years ago, just about the question of are libraries neutral. I'm going to read 2 quotes to you to sort of situate that, and you can take from them what you think is valuable. So the first quote is, "Libraries are spaces where we encounter real things. Books sit on shelves next to other books, and each book occupies a space that is strictly its own. No 2 books can occupy the same space at the same time. As their patrons can attest, there are only so many computer terminals in our computer labs, and only so many minutes in a day to be parceled out to each seat. Our information literacy classrooms and our exhibit cases and our public meeting rooms are similarly bounded by the real world. One English composition class at a time, one author talk at a time. Libraries and material, just as library workers and library patrons are. We are real, we exist, and we matter." Then she follows this up a bit later in her talk. She says, "The principle of neutrality is one that asks me to leave my political opinion somewhere other than the reference desk. But the truth is, I don't even think of my opinion as political, or even as an opinion. I can't get rid of it. It's mine. What I can do is foreground my way of understanding the world in our conversations so that we can begin to think about what it means, we can begin to think together about what, quote, the other side might be. That is easier to do when I know where I stand and how far I must imagine in order to think of my way to an alternative position." So again, 2 ways of thinking about not neutrality, but our positionality and material space in libraries. And if you want a way to think about this beyond what I've talked to you about, I would strongly encourage you to check out Lua Gregory and Shana Higgins' edited anthology called Information Literacy and Social Justice. In it are a ton of practitioners talking about how they still do their work as librarians with social justice orientations and still uphold the sort of professional values that we call librarianship, the things you're learning about in your classrooms. So again, checking this book out gives you a lot more context to the sort of flyby view I've given you of these issues. With that being said, I'm going to provide you with my email and my Twitter. You're welcome to reach out to me on either of these if you want to continue this discussion or if you have questions that weren't addressed in this brief presentation. But I hope that this has helped some, and again, I'm happy to help anytime in the future. Take care.